Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was in the early spring of 1894 when the case that came to be known in certain theatrical circles as the Midnight Siren Affair was first brought to our attention. The days were lengthening at last, and the soot-laced fogs that had lingered over Baker Street all winter were thinning into something nearer to mere gloom. I'd returned from a brisk morning round of my few remaining patients and found Holmes in one of his peculiarly inert moods. Sprawled in his chair like a marionette discarded by its puppeteer, his gaze fixed not upon me, but upon a spot somewhere deep within the Persian rug. His pipe, empty and unused, lay forgotten on the mantelpiece. This, I knew from long experience, meant one of two things. Either my friend was contemplating a problem, or else he was waiting for one to arrive. The problem, as it happened, came in just before noon, announced by a sharp knock and a timid voice on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson showed in a woman wrapped in a velvet cloak of deepest burgundy, her pale gloved hands clutching its folds tightly around her. Her complexion was of that clear porcelain rarely seen outside the stage, and though no trace of powder or rouge marred her skin, her presence had the deliberate poise of one well used to performance. Her eyes, pale blue and unnervingly steady, met Holmes's with something like defiance. "I believe," she said in a clear contralto, "that you are Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Holmes did not rise, but he inclined his head a fraction. "You are correct, madam, and you, I gather, are in some distress." Her lips quivered for the briefest moment, though she recovered herself quickly. "I would not trouble you if the matter were not rather strange. But I fear I have nowhere else to turn. Scotland Yard would laugh, and I cannot afford laughter." Holmes steepled his fingers under his chin. "You may speak freely, Miss—" She hesitated. "I am Miss Lark Trevelyan, a contralto at the Pavilion Theatre in Covent Garden. Or I was. I no longer perform." Holmes's brow lifted the merest fraction. "Indeed. I recall a review in the Times some 2 years ago, which described a Miss Trevelyan's rendering of Bellini as haunting to the point of madness." "That review," she said, folding her hands tightly in her lap, "was the beginning of my misfortunes." She spoke then of a recent series of events which, on the surface, might have seemed to belong more to the pages of the penny dreadfuls than to the life of a professional singer. "It began," she said, "with the sound of music. Specifically, her own voice, singing Casta Diva, drifting from the attic of her rented rooms at exactly midnight 3 nights ago. But the attic is empty," she said, "and locked. I have no key. No one has been up there since I moved in, except my landlady, to store old furniture. And yet I heard it. So did the maid. So did the constable I dragged in from the corner." Holmes, who had thus far been listening in perfect silence, now leaned forward. Precisely what did he hear? The music, or so he said. My voice in that aria, though I had not sung it aloud in months. And what's more, Mr. Holmes, I was not in the house. I had returned from a visit to my aunt in St. John's Wood and came in only after midnight. The constable was already in the stairwell when I arrived. He swears he heard the singing start from within the house at 12 precisely. From above, from the attic. There was a silence. Holmes drew a deep breath and released it slowly as though savoring the scent of a rare spice. "Miss Trevelyan," he said, "do you believe yourself in danger?" She flinched. Yes, but I cannot say from whom or what." "You said this began 3 nights ago." "Yes, that was the first time, but there have been other signs. Someone left a sprig of yew on my windowsill. The same night, a note appeared beneath my door. It said nothing but 'repent.'" Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Yew is not a flower one gives lightly." "No, She swallowed. It's used in funeral wreaths. He nodded once. And the handwriting. I brought the note. She produced a small folded sheet from her handbag. Holmes took it with reverent care and examined it with his lens. He did not speak for several seconds. Then he handed it to me. The script was odd, slanted to the right with exaggerated loops, as though someone had taken great care to appear unpracticed. The ink was uneven in places. A theatrical hand, perhaps. There is more, she said softly. Last night, someone entered the house. Your lodgings? Said Holmes, sitting up straighter. Yes, I was sleeping. I heard footsteps on the stairs and a door creak. My door. But when I lit the lamp, no one was there. The door was unlocked. Was anything taken? She hesitated. Only a photograph. One of myself and a man who is now dead. Ah, said Holmes, his voice like the blade of a knife entering water. Now we approach the heart. The room fell silent for a long moment. Holmes rose, finally, and went to stand at the window, his hands clasped behind his back. You will give me your address, he said without turning. I shall call there this evening. You are not to remain alone in the meantime. Take a friend with you or stay in a public place. Your landlady may be loyal, but I suspect she is not sufficient to guard against what is to come. Miss Trevelyan nodded. Thank you. I was told you might understand. Holmes turned at that. Who told you that? She hesitated again. The note, she said softly. It said to repent, but it also said, ask the man in Baker Street. He'll know why you sang. Watson tells us now that he saw Holmes go still, not in fear, but in a kind of stillness I've only seen in the most dangerous of his cases, when the game had not only begun, but had begun against him. As she left, the flat, her perfume still lingering in the air, a faint hint of lavender and iron, Holmes turned to me and said very quietly, Watson, I believe we are being invited to a performance. The question is, by whom and whether we are meant to applaud or perish before the final act. Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon in a state of taut, humming alertness I had seen only in the earliest stages of the most perplexing cases. The languor of the morning had vanished. He moved with brisk, almost mechanical precision, leafing through his private index of criminal correspondences, laying out maps of Covent Garden, and reading over the note Miss Trevelyan had left behind, as though it might vanish between glances. I, meanwhile, did what I always did in such times. I remained quiet, present, and ready. Ready to serve as sounding board, companion, and, when needed, a pair of fists more accustomed to back alleys than opera boxes. At 7:15, we set out through the damp London evening. Fog had begun to roll in again, clinging low along the stones and swirling about the gas lamps like something alive. The handsome ride was silent but swift, Holmes staring out the small pane of glass without speaking, his eyes moving in minute, rapid shifts, not outward, but inward. When we arrived at the address Miss Trevelyan had given us, a tall, narrow lodging-house off Endell Street, its brickwork pocked and soot-darkened, Holmes stepped from the cab with barely a word. Miss Trevelyan herself met us at the threshold. She had changed from her cloak into a simple dark dress, high-necked and unadorned, though the elegance of her posture remained unmistakable. A maid with red-rimmed eyes hovered behind her, the same, presumably, who had heard the mysterious midnight aria. "I've done as you asked," said Miss Trevelyan. "I haven't been alone since leaving Baker Street. Mary here has not left my side." Holmes gave the girl a brief nod, then turned to our hostess. "Good. I should like to see the attic first." Her face paled slightly. "Of course. It's through the top landing. I have the key from Mrs. Penhaligon, the landlady." We followed her up 4 narrow flights, the stair carpet worn to the threads and the banisters polished by generations of cautious hands. At the final landing, she produced a key and unlocked a narrow, warped door. It gave with a reluctant groan, and the smell that met us was that of dust, old wood, and something else. The faint suggestion of rosaille and faded perfume. The attic was dim, even with the oil lamp Holmes had brought. It was low-ceilinged and cluttered with old trunks, wooden chairs with missing rungs, and a broken cheval mirror propped against one wall. A single, narrow window admitted a haze of orange from the street lamp below. Holmes crouched at once, holding the lamp close to the warped floorboards. He sniffed, touched the wood with his fingers, and then ran them along the windowsill. "There was someone here," he murmured, "but not last night. Perhaps the night before." Miss Trevelyan's brow furrowed. "What makes you say that?" "Dust. There's a partial boot print here. A man's, square-toed, roughly size 9. The dust has not resettled fully, but there is a light scatter of particles across the sole. If it had been last night and the room had remained shut, there would be none." "Then how?" "The sound," said Holmes, "may not have come from the attic at all." He rose and crossed to the far wall. There he stood for a long moment, tapping lightly at the plaster with his knuckles, then with the handle of the lamp. On the third strike, a hollow note rang out, different from the muffled thud of the surrounding space. Holmes smiled thinly. "There's a void behind this wall. A crawl space, perhaps. No more than a foot deep, but enough for something. Or someone." He stepped back and turned to Miss Trevelyan. "Has anyone else been given access to the attic?" "Number only." "Mrs. Penhaligon has the key, and she swears it hasn't left her desk drawer." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, if you'd be so good as to fetch the landlady." I found Mrs. Penhaligon in her parlor on the second floor, knitting with the determined energy of a woman who finds conversation a strain. When I requested her presence upstairs, she came without complaint, though with no small curiosity. Holmes greeted her politely, then asked, "Madam, are you quite certain no one but yourself has had access to the attic?" She blinked. "Certainly not. I don't give out those keys like sweetmeats. There's nothing up there but broken furniture and cobwebs." Holmes gestured to the hollow panel. "Do you know of this space?" She peered at it. "No, sir. Never had a reason to inspect the walls." "Has any work been done in this house recently? A painter, plasterer, chimney sweep?" She frowned. "A few weeks ago, there was a man here to repair the sash in the second floor front. He was in and out in an afternoon. A Mr. Shearer, I think." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Did he go upstairs?" "I shouldn't think so. Not unless he took it on himself." "Thank you. That will do for now." When she had gone, Holmes turned again to Miss Trevelyan. "Have you any association with this Mr. Shearer?" "None at all," she said, her voice faint. "But I cannot say I'm surprised. There is something tight about the air in this house, as though it has been listening." Holmes nodded slowly. "You mentioned a photograph was taken from your room. I should like to see where it was kept." She led us down one floor to her chamber, which was modest and fastidiously neat. The photograph, she said, had sat atop her dressing table in a small silver frame. It had been there the morning of the second incident, but by the time she returned from her rehearsal that evening, it had vanished. No other belongings had been disturbed. "Who was the man in the photo?" Holmes asked, already examining the table and its surroundings. She hesitated. "He was a friend, an accompanist. His name was Dorian Vale. He died 2 years ago. A carriage accident in Hampstead." Holmes's voice was very gentle. "Was your connection with him public?" "Number we kept it private." "He was married." Holmes straightened. "Then perhaps not everyone was as unaware as you believed." He turned to the wall adjacent to the dressing table and tapped once more. Another hollow space. A ventilation shaft, perhaps. Or a clever passage. He knelt and inspected the skirting, then stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Watson," he said, "we are dealing with someone clever. Someone with knowledge of architecture, an interest in opera, and a reason to evoke the past rather than simply threaten. A ghost, yes, but one who wears very earthly shoes." He turned back to Miss Trevelyan. "This man, Mr. Vale, did he have enemies?" She looked away. "He had a wife." Holmes was silent a long moment. Then he moved to the door. "Lock this room tonight from within. Do not open it to anyone. Watson and I shall return tomorrow, or perhaps sooner if the music resumes. Leave a light burning. If your ghost is real, I intend to hear him sing." As we descended the stairs, Holmes paused on the second floor and knelt to examine the narrow corridor. I saw his eyes flick to a faint scrape along the baseboard, the sort left by something being dragged or shifted. He said nothing, only nodded to himself and continued down. Outside, the fog had thickened to a syrupy grey wall, muffling the clip of hooves and rendering the gas lamps halos in the mist. We walked in silence for a block before I asked, "Do you truly believe this is the work of a living man?" Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. "The dead do not compose notes in theatrical hand, Watson, nor do they steal photographs. But the singing has a rational source, though I have not yet named it. But I promise you this. Someone wishes Miss Trevelyan to relive something long buried, and tonight they shall try again. And what will we do?" Holmes stopped at the next corner and hailed a cab. "We shall visit the Pavilion Theatre," he said simply, "and ask after a man who died too soon, and a woman who perhaps knows more than she dares admit." The fog swallowed us as the cab turned east. The hansom cab rattled eastward through the fog-veiled lanes, the damp night hissing faintly against the gas-lit lanterns that flickered above the shop fronts. Holmes sat with one hand pressed to the inside of the window, his fingers drumming idly, though I knew the gesture belied a mind working furiously beneath the still surface. The name, Dorian Vale, had clearly struck some internal chord. His eyes, half-lidded but bright, watched the drifting shadows as though awaiting them to form into a pattern. "Holmes," I said, breaking the quiet, "do you believe Vale's death is central to the events in Miss Trevelyan's home?" "I believe," he said without looking at me, "that the dead are often the best accomplices for the living. Their silence, as ever, is most useful. But we shall see soon enough. I wish to know what reputation Mr. Dorian Vale left behind him, and who has remained to remember it." The Pavilion Theatre loomed over its square like a sleeping beast, dark now except for a single lantern glowing above the stage door and a pair of men smoking beneath the covered entrance. A poster board remained visible under a pane of scratched glass, still bearing the week's billing. Lark Trevelyan's name was notably absent. Holmes approached the stage door with the confidence of one long accustomed to ignoring locked entrances. The two men glanced up, one a thin youth with a limp cigarette, the other a stouter man with a night porter's keys hanging from his belt. Holmes addressed the latter. "You are Mr. Finch, are you not?" The man gave a start. "That's right, and who might you be?" Holmes passed him a card. "I am here about the late Mr. Dorian Vale." Finch's brow furrowed. "He's been dead near 2 years. What about him?" Holmes gestured toward the theatre. "Would you be so kind as to grant us 10 minutes in the wings? My colleague and I are conducting a quiet inquiry on behalf of a former performer." Finch hesitated. Holmes's gaze did not waver. With a grunt, the man unlocked the stage door and ushered us inside. The theatre was cold and empty, its vast red plush seats yawning like open mouths in the dark. Holmes walked with care across the worn boards of the stage, glancing upward to the catwalks and backdrops, his every movement precise. Behind the curtain, Finch led us to the green room, a modest chamber cluttered with forgotten scripts, faded costumes, and the smell of old grease paint. He sat heavily on a bench, while Holmes leaned against a dresser and asked quietly, "What can you tell me of Mr. Vale?" Finch scratched his jaw. "Brilliant man. Touched, some said, but brilliant. He had a way with the piano and a way with singers too. Worked with Miss Trevelyan for a stretch, the best pairing we had in years. Folk came just to hear her hold a note while he coaxed the keys. And then, Finch looked away. He died. Sudden. Carriage overturned up on Vale of Health Road. Driver survived. Vale didn't. Broke his neck, they said. There was talk it weren't an accident, but nothing came of it. What sort of talk? Finch exhaled. Rumors. His wife wasn't fond of his late nights, and he wasn't fond of hiding where he spent them. Some say she came here once and made a scene. But you know how theatre folk are. Everything's a scene. Do you know where she is now? Vanished. Took what little money he'd left and went north, I think. Yorkshire or Lancashire. No one's seen her since. Holmes gave a thoughtful nod. And Miss Trevelyan? Cracked a little after he died. Tried to carry on, but something in her voice changed. She left the company 3 months later. Said she was going to teach instead. Holmes turned toward me then, a gleam in his eye. You see, Watson? Grief dulls the blade, but it also carves new paths. Someone has chosen to reopen hers. He looked back to Finch. Was Mr. Vale known for any particular piece? Anything signature? Something he played often? Finch grinned, a memory sparking in his eye. Always ended rehearsals with Casta Diva. Said it suited her range and his soul. Holmes did not smile, but his eyes darkened, and he nodded once. Thank you, Mr. Finch. That will do. Outside, the fog had thickened, curling like smoke along the ground. Holmes walked swiftly now, his pace crisp and unrelenting. I matched his stride. There is an intelligence behind this, Watson, not merely a desire to frighten Miss Trevelyan, but to draw her back into something unfinished, and now we have a name that lingers even in absence. Dorian Vale's widow. Perhaps. But she would not be alone. If Vale was as reckless as suggested, he likely made enemies, debts, and intimacies. Some would mourn him. Others would resent those who shared his gifts. As we turned the corner toward Baker Street, a small boy in a patched coat darted from the mist and handed Holmes a folded scrap of paper. Holmes gave him a coin without a word, unfolded the note beneath the lamplight, and read in silence. Well? I asked. He handed it to me. The handwriting was the same slanted script as the first note Miss Trevelyan had received. Midnight again. Do you hear her yet? She sings for the sins you buried. Bring the doctor. This time he should listen too. There was no signature, only the faint imprint of a small pressed flower at the bottom of the page. You again. Holmes said, whoever this is, they watch her, and they watch us. We are not investigating from the outside, Watson. We have already stepped onto the stage. We did not return to Baker Street. Instead, Holmes redirected the cab to Endell Street, and we arrived before Miss Trevelyan's lodgings just before the clock struck 11. The lamps inside were still lit. Her window was dark. Holmes instructed me to wait at the corner, where the gaslight cast long shadows across the pavement. He slipped around the side of the house, vanishing into the alley like smoke. I remained in place, heart ticking faster as the fog crept higher around my boots. Minutes passed. Then, faintly, I heard it. A note. Pure, high, and unmistakable. Casta Diva. Miss Trevelyan's voice, or someone's mimicry of it, drifting from above like a lament spun from frost. I looked toward the attic window. It was dark, but the sound came clearer, surer, as if amplified by the very bones of the house. A second later, figure moved behind the glass. I stepped forward instinctively. But Holmes's silhouette emerged from the alley at the same moment, raising a gloved hand in warning. The music stopped. He reached me seconds later, breath visible in the cold. She's asleep, he whispered. The singing came from the crawl space, but the attic door was ajar, and there were fresh prints in the dust. Did you see the singer? I saw movement, but not clearly. Whoever it was slipped into the wall before I reached the top landing. We stood in silence beneath the shadow of the house. Then Holmes said, "Watson, tomorrow you and I shall go to Hampstead, not to question the living, but to visit the dead. I must see Dorian Vale's grave and learn who else has been placing flowers upon it." And with that, we turned into the fog, leaving behind the house where the woman still sang, though for whom and why remained cloaked in the shadows that even Holmes had not yet pierced. The following morning dawned pale and windless, with a low sky the color of tarnished silver. We broke our fast quickly, Holmes taking little more than tea and a single slice of buttered toast, his appetite dulled by thought. And by 9:30 we were in a cab heading northward. Our destination, Hampstead Cemetery. The final resting place, according to the registers Holmes had consulted over a hasty telegram and return reply of one Mr. Dorian Vale. The ride passed in silence, save for Holmes's intermittent murmurs, fragments of names, half-formed deductions, the mechanical rehearsal of a mind narrowing its variables. I left him to it. Years at his side had taught me that questions at such times were less help than hindrance. He would speak when ready. The cemetery lay in a grove of half-wild yew and ash, the bare branches rattling faintly overhead. We passed weather-worn stones and moss-draped angels as we followed the narrow path to the eastern quadrant, where the more recent graves stood in neat rows. Holmes, holding the register in one hand, stopped before a simple stone of grey slate. Dorian Vale, 1861 to 1892. In silence, still music. The epitaph was curious. Holmes studied it intently, then knelt, brushing the leaves and damp soil from the base. There, half hidden beneath the roots of an overgrown weed, lay a small object wrapped in oilskin. He lifted it carefully, unwrapped it, and revealed a dried yew sprig tied with black ribbon and a photograph. The image was old but clear. Dorian Vale at the piano, his head turned toward a woman in profile, Miss Trevelyan. They were laughing. Holmes turned the photo over. On the reverse, in the same slanted, theatrical hand as the notes, someone had written, "I remember everything you forgot." "Someone comes here often," Holmes said, standing. "The grave is tended, no overgrowth, no animal marks, and the yew is fresh within the week." I looked about. The place was still. A groundskeeper, sir. The distance pushed a wheelbarrow along a gravel path, but no one else was visible. "You believe it's her?" I asked. "Vale's widow?" It would fit. A grudge, nourished in solitude. A belief that Trevelyan escaped justice or guilt. But I do not believe she acts alone. Who else, then? Someone close to her. Someone who knew their habits, their music. A performer, perhaps. A rival. Someone who loved Vale, or hated what he represented. Holmes returned the items to the oilskin and left them exactly as we had found them. "Let them think the shrine undisturbed," he said. "We gain more by observation than confrontation. For now." As we walked back to the gates, I glanced once more at the name on the stone. There was something terribly final in its stillness. Yet it was from this stillness I knew that Holmes would draw the beating heart of the case. Back in Baker Street by midday, Holmes paced the sitting room like a panther at restive edge, his fingers locked behind his back, his eyes unblinking. He had declined lunch. I, on the other hand, had taken a modest sandwich from Mrs. Hudson and was halfway through it when he stopped abruptly. "Watson, how much do you recall of the mahogany stage incident? The attempted poisoning of the soprano?" "Fair amount." "Why?" "Because the composer involved, Howard Cray, was also Vale's former pupil. He came up in the same season at the Pavilion, though his fame never matched Dorian's. Jealous, eccentric, dismissed quietly after an incident involving a missing libretto and a very public argument. He faded after Vale's death. but I wonder if he has entirely vanished. You think Cray may be behind this? I think he knew them both, and if he is not the architect, then perhaps he's the instrument. Holmes stepped to the desk and penned a brief note. To Mycroft, he explained. If Cray is still in London, he'll be known to the underground circles, or the theatres. My brother keeps tabs on both in his own way. He dispatched the note, then reached for his coat. And now, Watson, back to Endell Street. I should like to know what Miss Trevelyan dreamed last night, if anything. We arrived to find the house unnervingly quiet. No footsteps on the stair, no clatter from the landlady's kitchen. Holmes rang the bell sharply. It was answered after a moment by the maid Mary, her eyes wide and her hands trembling against the apron she clutched. She's gone, she whispered. Miss Trevelyan, her room's open. No note. Holmes brushed past her at once and mounted the stairs 2 at a time. I followed, heart tight in my chest. Her room was exactly as we had seen it before, except now the oil lamp had burned out on the nightstand and the wardrobe door stood slightly ajar. Her bed was untouched. The window latch had been drawn open from inside. Holmes inspected it closely. No forced entry, he murmured. She left by choice, but why? Perhaps she received another note, I offered. Holmes turned sharply. Or perhaps someone called her name. If you wished to lure a singer, Watson, would you not use music? He crossed to the dressing table and examined the vanity top. There, among the combs and rouge brushes, lay a folded handkerchief. On it was a faint smear of red. Not blood, but lipstick. A fresh application. She prepared to leave, not rushed, not abducted, and she took nothing else. Holmes straightened. She was drawn, not taken. A sudden voice from the stairwell startled us. Mrs. Penhaligon stood at the threshold, her face pale, her hand to her bosom. I saw her go, she said, just after dawn. She was humming, that same tune. She looked not frightened, but calm. Dreaming, maybe. Like she was following something no one else could hear. Did she speak? Holmes asked. Just one thing, said the landlady. As she passed me on the stair, she said, He's waiting where the music ends. Holmes was still. Then he said, Come, Watson. I believe I know where she's gone. We took another cab, south this time into the fog-thick edge of the river districts. Holmes gave the driver a name I had not heard in years. Cray's Hollow, an abandoned music hall near Lambeth, derelict since a fire half a decade prior. Rumor held that it had once hosted rehearsals for the pavilion's overflow productions, but the fire had left it gutted. The theatre remained shuttered, avoided even by the vagrants. As we approached, I saw why Holmes had chosen it. Across the scorched frame of the old proscenium arch was a carved phrase, barely visible through grime and soot. In silence, still music, the same as Vale's epitaph. Holmes stepped lightly across the rubble-strewn entrance. The interior was choked with dust and ash, but faint footprints were visible along the boards. Holmes traced them with his eyes. She came here, he whispered. Alone. A sound echoed from within, a single note, then another, a piano, broken, out of tune, but undeniably playing. Holmes motioned for silence and moved forward, every step deliberate. We reached the cracked door of what had once been the orchestra pit, and there, in the dim light from a broken roof pane, stood Loch Trevelyan. She was singing, not to us, to someone or something we could not yet see. The piano continued, though no player was visible. Holmes stepped forward, and his voice, calm but razor-edged, cut the air. Miss Trevelyan, you must stop. You're not alone. She turned slowly, her eyes wide but unseeing. I had to, she said. He said it would be the last time. Holmes's eyes scanned the shadows, and then we heard it, a whisper of footsteps behind the curtain. Holmes nodded once to me. The curtain rises, he said, and the ghost prepares his bow. Holmes took a slow step forward, placing himself between Miss Trevelyan and the faint sound that had emerged behind the ruined curtain. The boards creaked faintly beneath his feet, though the piano notes, uncertain, halting now, continued as if some half-remembered song were struggling to complete itself through trembling hands. Lark Trevelyan stood motionless, her face uplifted in the shadowy half-light, lips parted slightly, as though the music held her by invisible threads. "Miss Trevelyan," Holmes said softly, "this place is not what it once was. You are being led by a memory someone else wishes to control." Her eyes moved toward him, but they seemed to look beyond him. "I heard him, Mr. Holmes. His voice. He called me by name, the way only Dorian did. It came from the stage. There is someone here," Holmes said, "but it is not your Dorian. You must trust me." She closed her eyes then, and for a moment I feared she might faint, but she exhaled and stepped back, her fingers clenching into her skirt. Holmes inclined his head toward me without turning. I took his meaning instantly and moved to her side, guiding her gently down the shallow steps to a safe remove. Holmes advanced to the edge of the curtain and paused. Then, in a voice colder and more commanding than I had heard from him in months, he said, "The game is over. Come out." For a moment there was silence. Then the piano stopped, and a man stepped out from behind the frayed velvet folds. He was perhaps in his mid-40s, with lank hair that hung just past his collar, and a sharp-featured hollow face that bore the pale sheen of a man long detached from sunlight and society. His coat was black and dusted with ash, his cravat frayed at the edges. But what struck me most were his eyes, fixed, shining, and utterly mad. "Mr. Cray," Holmes said without surprise. The man inclined his head with exaggerated civility. "Mr. Holmes, I wondered when you would attend my little performance." "You've rehearsed it well," Holmes replied evenly. "But even the most practiced aria cannot disguise a cracked voice." Cray's lips curled into something like a smile. "But I was always the better accompanist, you know. Vale only had passion. I had structure, precision, a mind for echo and silence." "You also had jealousy." Cray did not blink, and I turned it into art. He stepped toward the piano and laid a pale hand on its edge. She never sang so well as when she thought he was listening. That first night I played it from the crawl space. She froze. Then she cried. But then, "Mr. Holmes," she sang. "You manipulated her grief." "I gave it shape." Cray's voice rose sharply. "You saw the world try to erase her after Vale's death. No more solos. No more roles. They said her voice had faded, that she was nothing without him, but it wasn't true. It was never true. She only needed the right conductor." "She did not consent to your arrangement," Holmes said coldly. "She will," Cray whispered. "In time." He looked at me then, and the glint in his eyes sent a chill up my spine. "And you, Doctor, tell me, is it madness to bring back greatness? If her voice reaches its height again, even for one night, is that not worth it?" I said nothing. Holmes did not move. "How did you know she would come?" "I never stopped watching," Cray said almost tenderly. "I kept close to her old life, the boarding house, the grave, the theater. I left the notes. I set the scene, and when she came here last year, just once, to look upon the ashes of this place, I knew she had not forgotten. I knew the moment would come again. You broke into her rooms. You stole the photograph. I needed it," he said simply, "to complete the memory, and I left her enough to follow, like breadcrumbs in a score. She came, didn't she?" Holmes stepped forward once more, and his voice grew firmer. "And what now? You think she will stay?" "I think," Cray said quietly, "that if she sings once more, here, in the place where we rehearsed, she will understand. The past is the only real thing. Everything else is noise." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You've kept more than notes, Mr. Cray. Where is the gramophone?" Cray's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker in his gaze. "There's no gramophone." "There is," Holmes said. "You left too much dust disturbed in the crawl space. The resonance we heard last night, it wasn't live, not all of it. You used her own recordings, layered with accompaniment." Cray's fingers flexed. "Then what of it?" "You staged a haunting," Holmes said, "one calculated to reopen a wound and offer yourself as its balm. But your mistake was thinking she would not see the hand behind the curtain." At this, Cray's face broke, not into fury, but a deep, awful sadness. "She won't sing for me," he said. "She never did. She sang for him." There was a clatter. From behind the stage curtain, a wooden case fell open, spilling records and wires, a small gramophone, a crude setup of amplification hidden among the rubble. Holmes turned slightly, his voice now lower, almost kind. "You orchestrated this so thoroughly, Mr. Cray. But what is a conductor without an orchestra? You've alienated the very soul you wish to restore." "She'll understand," he murmured. "She must." But she already stood in the doorway behind us, her eyes wide and bright with understanding. "No," she said. "I won't." Cray turned, slowly. "Lark." "No," she said again, firmer now. "You turned my grief into a stage. You made my voice your instrument, and that was never yours to take." "I loved you both," Cray said softly. "Then you should have let him rest," she said. The silence that followed was long and hollow. The wind had picked up beyond the cracked roof, rustling the shattered rafters like strings under strain. Holmes nodded once to me, and I stepped forward. Cray did not resist. He looked as though a part of him had broken with the sound of her voice. We walked him out through the ruined door and handed him to the waiting constable Holmes had summoned earlier by telegram. A plan laid before we ever left Baker Street that morning. Miss Trevelyan stood alone in the wings, her silhouette sharp against the cold light filtering through the ruined theatre. Holmes joined her there. "You knew," she said, "before we came." "I suspected," Holmes said, "but I did not wish to rob you of the chance to speak for yourself." She was quiet a long while. Then she said, "He never wanted me to cling to ghosts. Dorian. He once told me that music only lives when it ends." Holmes inclined his head. I believe he was right. She turned to him and smiled, a small, sad thing. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." We left the theatre in silence. Holmes did not speak again until we were in the cab, the city passing by in soft blurs. Then, finally, he said, "There is more pain in memory than in truth, Watson. But in performance, there, sometimes, we find release." And I, who had seen him speak more eloquently to corpses than to souls in pain, said nothing at all, because I believed he spoke for himself. We returned to Baker Street just as the church bells tolled 2, their solemn echoes stretching across the city like the slow closing of a curtain. Holmes said little upon our arrival. He removed his coat with methodical detachment, lit a fire with his usual precision, and then stood at the hearth for a long while, the flames reflecting in his eyes, but not warming them. I made tea, the simple gesture of civility that, between Holmes and myself, stood as an unspoken offering of peace after the weight of any case. He took it with a quiet nod, but did not drink immediately. Instead, he resumed pacing the room with his hands behind his back, his lips compressed and his brows drawn together in a line that I'd come to recognize not as tension, but as dissatisfaction. "You are not content," I said at last. Holmes did not answer for a moment. Then, "Cray was the hand, Watson, but not the mind." I looked up from my chair. "You believe he did not act alone. I believe he acted under the impression that he alone was guiding the drama. But there is a deeper intelligence behind the sequence of events, one that predates his descent into obsession. He turned then, abruptly, and retrieved the photograph we had recovered from Vale's grave. He studied the reverse again, the message in its stylized hand. "I remember everything you forgot." "Notice the wording," Holmes said. "It is not addressed to Trevelyan. It is addressed to Vale. You forgot, not she." As though the writer bore a deeper betrayal, one that originated with him. He crossed to the bureau and retrieved the earlier note, the first one Miss Trevelyan had received, and laid it beside the photo. "Same hand," he muttered, "but different tone. One seeks remembrance, the other punishment. A split voice, or two authors with similar means." "But what could Vale have done that would warrant such sustained vengeance?" I asked. "He was a musician, impulsive perhaps, unfaithful certainly, but his death was an accident." "Was it?" Holmes said. The word hung there between us. "You believe it was murder?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that the odds of a carriage turning precisely on a bend during a moment of brake failure with no subsequent mechanical explanation, and a surviving driver with no name recorded on the official inquest, are—" He paused. "Inconvenient. And that sort of inconvenience, Watson, often hides design." He moved to his files again, retrieving the newspaper clippings he had studied earlier in the case. Among them was the original article on Vale's death, brief, poorly sourced, and curiously devoid of detail. A single line stood out now in Holmes's rapid review. "The driver, reportedly an itinerant coachman hired at the last minute, has not come forward." "No follow-up," Holmes muttered. "No inquiry. No name." I leaned forward. "You think the driver vanished because he was paid to vanish?" "Possibly," Holmes said. "But the clearer pattern lies not in the death, but in the aftermath. Trevelyan was cast aside. Cray grew more reclusive. The theatre declined. But someone prospered. Someone stepped into the vacuum left behind." I frowned. "Finch?" Holmes shook his head. "Numbery remains what he is. A relic, harmless and rooted. But who replaced Vale at the pavilion in the months following his death?" He retrieved a second clipping, a theatre bill dated 3 months later. There it was. "Musical director, Madeline Vale." I sat back. His wife. Holmes's gaze did not leave the paper. A curious appointment, is it not? A woman who had no prior billing, no public performance history, suddenly named director at the very theatre where her husband had achieved his greatest acclaim. And under a different name, Monsieur Valiant, a slight pseudonym, but not quite a disguise. She used the theatre to preserve his memory. "No," Holmes said. "She used it to rewrite it." He turned to me. "Imagine, Watson, a woman scorned not just by a husband's betrayal, but by his elevation of another. Then he dies. Conveniently, quietly. She inherits not only his estate, but his position. She has motive, means, and now a reason to erase and reframe. But years pass. Guilt curdles into fixation. She finds Cray, damaged, malleable, obsessed with the same muse. She nudges him, suggests, plants memories, offers recordings. Holmes stepped closer to the fire. She becomes the impresario of a ghost. I stood slowly. "Then we must find her." He nodded. "Already in motion. I telegraphed Mycroft again this morning, before we left. For the cemetery. If she has remained in London, as I suspect, we'll have her location before nightfall." We waited. Just after 6, a telegram arrived. Holmes opened it without sitting, scanned its contents, and tossed it across to me. "Monsieur Valiant, registered under Miss Vale, resides Carnaby House, Bloomsbury. Widow, patron of private music society, surveilled intermittently. Last public attendance, Lark Trevelyan recital, 1893. I looked up. She's still watching. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Carnaby House proved to be a tall Georgian structure nestled behind a high hedge and iron gate, quiet and respectable, with ivy climbing its brickwork like old scars. Holmes rang the bell. A maid answered. Holmes presented his card. After a long pause, we were shown to a drawing room of surprising austerity. No portraits, no flowers, no personal effects beyond a metronome and a stack of musical scores. A woman entered a moment later. She was perhaps 50, composed, elegant, and wholly self-contained. Her eyes were grey, her posture erect. She did not sit. "You are Mr. Holmes." "I am." "I presume this is about the singer." Holmes inclined his head. "You orchestrated this, Mrs. Vale. Through Cray, through the notes, through memory. But you miscalculated the finale." She said nothing. Holmes continued. "You did not expect her to resist." "I expected her to remember," she said quietly. "I wanted her to see what she destroyed." "She destroyed nothing," Holmes said. "You clung to what you lost and made it unrecognizable. Your husband's ghost is not in her voice, only in your bitterness." Her expression remained unchanged, but her fingers twitched once at her side. "I did not kill him," she said, "but you let him die." Her eyes flicked to the fire. "He was already gone." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, "We will not pursue criminal charges. The law cannot indict you for what Cray chose to do. But he will speak, and the story will surface. You would be wise to withdraw from the public stage. Permanently." She nodded once. When we left Carnaby House, the wind had risen and the sky was beginning to rain. Holmes walked with his head low against the cold, and I said nothing until we reached Baker Street. Then I asked, "Do you think she regrets it?" Holmes shrugged. "Regret is another kind of performance, Watson. Sometimes sincere, often staged. I no longer pretend to judge which is which." And he went inside without another word, as the city's rain fell around us, cleansing nothing but silencing, for now, the last ghost of that terrible song. It was 2 days before we saw Miss Trevelyan again. The storm that had begun as a thin drizzle on the evening we confronted Madeline Vale had deepened into a steady, chill rain that turned the streets to gleaming obsidian and muffled the city's heartbeat. During that time, Holmes remained mostly silent, not withdrawn, but reflective, as if drawing a curtain in his own mind to separate the solved from the unsolved, the witnessed from the remembered. On the morning of the third day, a letter arrived, unsealed, hand-delivered, bearing no signature. The handwriting, however, was unmistakable. "Mr. Holmes, I have not sung since that night. I do not know if I will again, but I have found a kind of stillness I did not believe was possible. If you wish to speak before this chapter closes, you may find me where it began. L.T." Holmes read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it on the mantel. "She means the pavilion," he said simply. We arrived there just after noon, escorted by the same surly Finch who had admitted us days earlier. The theatre was quiet, the matinee curtain still hours from rising. Miss Trevelyan stood alone at the edge of the stage, looking out over the empty rows of crimson seats. She turned as we entered and offered a small smile. Not the smile of performance, but of acknowledgement. Her bearing was still graceful, but there was a weight in her shoulders now that I had not seen before, a certain honesty to her silence. "You received my letter," she said. Holmes nodded. "I did, and I hope to see you here, in the light." She glanced around the stage, her eyes tracing the outlines of the orchestra pit, the backdrop, the box tiers, familiar territory made strange by memory. "I came here yesterday," she said. "The door was open. Finch told me they've been considering restoring the hall for a new season." "Will you return to it?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "Not as I was. Perhaps never as a performer, but I might teach. There are young voices here now, some of them raw and afraid. I could guide them, not in grief, but through it." Holmes stepped closer. There is courage in your choice. The theater remembers more than just music. It remembers everything we bring to it. She looked at him then, directly. Did she speak to you? Madeline Vale. Holmes nodded. She spoke, but what she revealed was not confession, only decay. Do you think she truly loved him? She asked. Dorian, I mean. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he said, she loved what he represented. But that kind of love demands possession, not freedom. It feeds on resentment, not reverence. She considered that, then smiled faintly. You sound like you've seen it before. I have, Holmes replied. Not often, but always at a cost. The room was quiet then. No echo, no rehearsal. Only the tick of Finch's pocket watch somewhere in the wings. I kept one of the notes, she said after a moment. The first, the one that said repent. I read it now and I hear her voice behind it. Not accusing, just tired. As if she wanted to share the burden but no longer remembered why. Holmes nodded once. Cray was her instrument but not her equal. He believed he was. Composing a resurrection, she knew she was composing a dirge. She looked down at the stage boards. He was dangerous. He was broken, Holmes said, and that made him available. She needed someone to enact what she no longer had the strength or visibility to do. I think, she said quietly, that he believed he was saving me. Holmes's expression did not soften, but his tone did. Delusion often wears the mask of devotion. She turned back toward the empty house, her voice now lower. I sang for a ghost, Mr. Holmes, but it wasn't Dorian. It was the ghost of what we were told we must be. Tragic, beautiful, unfinished. And now? I asked. She straightened, but gently. Now I will write, teach, perhaps even walk the stage again, but not to repeat the past. Holmes stepped beside her. Then you have done what neither of your tormentors could. You have survived the performance and chosen not to repeat it. She exhaled deeply. There's a rehearsal beginning soon. A new production. The Magic Flute. I said I'd sit in and advise the new Papagena. We took the cue. Holmes inclined his head respectfully, and I followed him back into the aisle, our footsteps barely sounding over the worn carpet. Just as we reached the main doors, she called out, Mr. Holmes. He turned. She stood at the edge of the stage, half in shadow. There is one thing I still wonder. Yes? When you stood in the ruined hall and you heard my voice, before you knew it was a recording, before you saw Cray, what did you think? Holmes considered. Then, in that rarest of moments, he spoke not as the logician, but as the listener. I thought, he said, that something long dead had remembered how to sing. For a moment, I wasn't certain whether I should be afraid or moved. She bowed her head once, and we left her there, where the lights would soon rise on a different story. Back at Baker Street, the rain had lifted, and the sun was filtering faintly through the soot-dark sky. Holmes hung his coat on the peg and sat without speaking. I took my usual chair opposite him. After a few minutes, he reached into the side drawer and withdrew the note Miss Trevelyan had saved, the one marked Repent. He studied it for a long moment, then dropped it into the fire. The flames caught quickly, curling the paper into ash with a hiss. He sat back. Well, Watson, he said, there will be no trial, no headlines, no reward, but the case is closed. I believe, I said, it closed when she chose not to sing. Holmes did not smile, but he looked, for once, at peace. There are cases, he murmured, where justice wears no uniform. Only silence. And with that, the room was quiet, and we let the fog move on without us. It was nearly a week later, in the calm that so often follows the conclusion of one of Holmes's more intricate cases, when the final coda to the affair arrived, not as a shock, nor as a scandal, but in the form of a subtle ripple, disturbing the waters just enough to suggest the story had not fully ended when the curtain last fell. Holmes and I were seated in our sitting room, the Morning Post between us. The day was unusually bright, with the sunlight casting geometric patterns across the floorboards through the slatted blinds. I had just returned from a walk through Regent's Park and was reading a review in the Times, not of a criminal case or political scandal, but of the Pavilion Theatre's latest debut. "You may find this of interest," I said aloud, though Holmes gave no indication of listening. His gaze was fixed on the violin in his lap, which he had been tuning half-heartedly for the better part of 20 minutes. Nonetheless, I read the review aloud, more for myself than for him. "The newly remounted production of The Magic Flute is remarkable not for its spectacle, but for its restraint," I recited. "The ensemble is capably led by a newly appointed voice director, L. Trevelyan, whose return to the theatre has already caused whispers in artistic circles. Her presence does not overshadow the performers, but rather elevates them, with one newcomer in particular, Miss Clara Hawthorne, delivering a Papagena both charming and haunting. The influence of Trevelyan's past is felt not in repetition, but in the careful space she grants others to bloom." Holmes's fingers paused against the strings. I lowered the paper. "There is healing in that, I think." "Perhaps," he murmured. He set the violin down and turned in his chair toward the fire, though it had long since burned to embers. "Trevelyan has taken a rare path, Watson. She refused to make herself either martyr or mystery. She gave the ghost no encore." I nodded. "And what of Madeline Vale?" Holmes picked up a small envelope from the side table, one I had seen but not opened. He passed it to me without comment. The wax seal had been broken, and the contents were spare. No letter, only a folded sheet containing a single line in that same unmistakable hand. For what I destroyed, I leave silence. There was no name, no return address, but the watermark of the paper, Carnaby and Sons, Bloomsbury, confirmed its origin. "I do not expect we will hear from her again," Holmes said. "She has done what she set out to do, not vengeance, not justice, but erasure, and she has finally succeeded in erasing herself." "And Cray?" I asked. Holmes gestured toward the fire with one hand. "Detained, quietly. No charges pressed, but his mental condition has deteriorated. The authorities will place him under long-term observation. I doubt he will see another stage." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of those truths neither heavy nor light. They simply were. Holmes had never been a man to seek emotional closure, and yet I sensed in him a kind of reluctant respect for Trevelyan's choices and perhaps even for the quiet devastation left in Vale's wake. It was just after noon when Mrs. Hudson arrived, bearing a visitor's card on a silver tray. Holmes took it, examined it briefly, and raised a brow. He handed it to me without a word. "Clara Hawthorne, Pavilion Theatre, Covent Garden." We exchanged a glance. Moments later, the young soprano was ushered in. She was no more than 20, with a quiet poise that reminded me faintly of Trevelyan in her earliest moments with us, nervous yet composed, eyes bright with something more than ambition. She sat primly at the edge of the settee, holding her gloves tightly in one hand. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Mr. Holmes," she began, "but I wasn't sure who else to speak to." Holmes regarded her gently. "Please, Miss Hawthorne, say what you came to say." She took a breath. "It's about Miss Trevelyan. I admire her greatly. She's taught me more in 3 weeks than I learned in 3 years. But lately, she's distant, not unkind, just listening to something I can't hear." Holmes said nothing. "She never sings," Clara continued, "not even to demonstrate a passage, but sometimes when she thinks no one is nearby, she hums. Just a few bars. A pattern I don't recognize." Low, sad Holmes' expression was unreadable. And what is it you fear, Miss Hawthorne? Clara hesitated. That something hasn't let go of her. That something followed her from that night. She never speaks of it, but sometimes I see her fingers moving as if she's playing a melody only she knows. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Do you believe she's in danger? No, she said quickly. It's not that. It's more like she's haunted by choice, and I don't know whether to let her be or try to bring her back. He was silent for a moment, then said, You may tell her something from me. Clara nodded, waiting. Tell her, Holmes said quietly, that ghosts only linger where they are wanted. If hers remains, it is because she still permits it a seat in the hall. Clara looked puzzled, but nodded again. I'll tell her. She rose then, thanked us, and left as swiftly as she had arrived. Holmes sat unmoving after she had gone, his gaze turned slightly to the corner of the room where the light fell through the lace curtain. That girl will do well, he said finally. I believe so, I replied. And Miss Trevelyan? She will fade from public view in time, become myth, perhaps legend. He rose, stretched once, then crossed to the window. Do you know what lingers with me, Watson? He asked. No. That note she sang, the one that Cray tried to summon through tape and terror, it still echoes, but not as it was. It changed. In that final moment when she refused to sing for him, that silence was a note more perfect than any aria. I looked at him, and for the first time in many days, I saw Holmes not as the calculating machine of logic and observation, but as something far rarer, a man touched by the fragility of human grace. We said no more of the case after that day. There were other clients, other crimes. The theatre faded once again into the backdrop of London's restless stages. But sometimes, on evenings when Holmes took up his violin and played something slow and unresolved, I would remember the woman who sang at midnight and the echo of a performance never completed, but more powerful for its absence. And in those moments I understood that not all resolutions are written in ink. Some are composed in silence, and some are heard only by those who choose to listen. The final act, as it were, played out not in confrontation or revelation, but in absence, a slow unwinding of tension that left the spaces between moments fuller than the moments themselves. In the weeks following Miss Hawthorne's visit, the matter of Lark Trevelyan faded from public curiosity. The newspapers took little interest in what did not end in arrest, scandal, or death, and so the shadows receded. But Holmes and I, though rarely speaking of it aloud, carried the weight of the affair like an unfinished chord still hanging in the air, waiting to resolve. One grey afternoon, I returned from an appointment in Marylebone to find Holmes at the window, not with his violin, but with a notebook I recognized as one of his private ledgers. He rarely opened them in my presence, and when he did, it was usually with the air of closing a chapter rather than exploring one. He sat motionless, the edges of the pages pressed under his fingers, his gaze lost in the late autumn drizzle. I didn't speak. Instead, I set down my umbrella and stood at the opposite window, watching the passers-by below in their mufflers and overcoats. The world went on, indifferent and unchanged. Yet there was something altered in the silence between us, something heavier and more solemn than usual. She wrote again, Holmes said finally, his voice low. I turned. He still hadn't moved. Trevelyan, I asked. He nodded. A brief note, no signature, but hers, unquestionably. He passed it to me. The girl sings well. She reminds me of who I might have become, had I been seen sooner and not heard only when grieving. You were right. I let the ghost in, and I let it leave. There was nothing else. I folded it slowly and returned it. So it is finished. Perhaps, Holmes said, but I have learned that the endings we accept often differ from the endings that remain. People rarely close the door. They simply stop looking behind them. He placed the letter back in the notebook, shut it gently, and stood. For a moment, I thought he might reach for his pipe or summon Mrs. Hudson for tea, but instead, he walked to the fireplace and lit the fire himself. A rare gesture from a man who delegated domesticity as easily as he defied sentiment. As the flames grew, he said, "Do you know why? The case unsettled me, Watson." I shook my head. It was not the manipulation, nor the death, nor even the unpunished hand behind it. It was the use of music, the exploitation of something pure. The voice is the last honest thing in a performer. It reveals what even the eyes conceal, and they took hers, rewrote it, recorded it, fed it back to her like a ghost in a mirror. He turned toward me. There are crimes of violence and crimes of greed, but this was a crime of presence, of reshaping identity until the subject no longer recognizes herself. I said nothing. I had known Holmes to dismantle men who forged banknotes, who stole rubies, who poisoned silently. But this, the theft of a soul through memory and melody, had clearly touched something more intimate in him. Perhaps because Holmes himself, for all his logic, lived within an elaborate composition of silences and selections. He too chose what to reveal and what to leave unwritten. That evening, he did something he had not done in many years. He invited me to dine with him outside of Baker Street, not at our usual gentlemen's club, nor at a discreet corner of Simpson's, but at a modest supper room near the Strand, where musicians occasionally gathered after rehearsal. The atmosphere was casual, the food unpretentious, and the conversation at the surrounding tables ran from bowing technique to backstage gossip. Holmes listened more than he spoke. But as we were finishing our meal, a familiar figure entered, Miss Clara Hawthorne, wrapped in a modest cloak and accompanied by another young singer I did not know. Holmes inclined his head in greeting, and she smiled, hesitated, then crossed to our table. "I didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Holmes," she said brightly, though there was a flicker of wariness in her eyes. He stood and gestured toward the empty seat. "Only if you have a moment." She looked at her companion, who nodded and drifted to a nearby table. Clara sat. "I gave her your message," she said. She didn't answer directly, but I think she heard it. Holmes nodded. "And you?" "Has she spoken to you since?" Clara shrugged. "Not of what happened, but she sings now. Softly. Not for performance, not even for teaching. Just as if remembering how it felt before it became dangerous." He smiled faintly. "Then she's healing." "I think so, but I think she's also afraid that healing means forgetting." Holmes's voice lowered. "It doesn't. It means choosing which part of memory deserves your breath." Clara studied him. "She said you'd say something like that." Holmes looked genuinely amused. "Then she remembers me well." A brief silence followed, and then she reached into her satchel and handed him a folded sheet of music. "She gave me this to pass on, said it was the original arrangement, before Cray tampered with it, her and Dorian's last collaborative piece. She said you'd understand why it matters." Holmes unfolded it with care. The title, handwritten at the top, read, "Nocturne in Silence." I saw him study the notation, sparse, unembellished, intimate. A duet written for voice and piano, but with several marked silences woven deliberately into the bars. It was not a grand aria. It was a whisper. "She never performed it publicly," Clara said. "Said it was too raw, too real." Holmes folded it again. "Then it was always meant to be private, and it shall remain so." She smiled, stood, and returned to her companion. We walked home that night beneath a sky clear enough to reveal stars, faint and blinking above the lamps. Holmes held the music lightly in one hand. Back at Baker Street, he placed it in the locked drawer beneath his writing desk and said nothing further about it. The case was not one he would include in his published accounts. It would not be known to the Yard or chronicled in the papers. But it had changed something in him. Not broken, not reformed, but subtly adjusted, like a key turned one notch in a lock, allowing a door to open just a little wider. I watched him that evening as he finally took up his violin again and began to play. It was not one of his usual furious sonatas or sharp stabbing pizzicati. It was something softer, hesitant but not unsure. A melody in half-light, a song not of resolution but release. He played for no one but the shadows. And for once, the shadows listened. It was in early December, as frost began to rim the windows of Baker Street and the air carried the faint scent of coal smoke and damp wool, that Holmes received the final correspondence related to the affair. It arrived by hand, though no messenger was seen, folded inside the pages of the Strand magazine which had been left on our doorstep rather than posted through the slot. It was not addressed to Holmes nor to myself, but bore only 2 words, written in a spare, elegant script across the blank margin of the article, featuring Holmes's own recent exposure of a smuggling ring in Portsmouth. "Thank you." Holmes read it once, tore off the margin with the inscription, and tucked it into the pages of the music manuscript Miss Hawthorne had delivered weeks before. He did not comment, nor did he need to. By then, we both understood that the case had concluded not with arrest or revelation, but with a reclamation. Miss Trevelyan had not been saved. She had saved herself, and in doing so had rescued from the wreckage the one thing no one else could: her future. I mention this now, not because it was extraordinary by the usual standards of Holmes's cases, but because it lingered. It left a trace in the atmosphere of our rooms, in the way Holmes moved through the days that followed. Not more slowly, nor more thoughtfully. Holmes did not brood, but with a kind of narrowed intensity, as if something had shifted in the lens through which he viewed the world. He was quieter than usual, but not withdrawn. His violin came out more often, but the selections he played were gentler, almost private in their phrasing. Gone were the aggressive improvisations he summoned in moments of intellectual tension. Instead, he played nocturnes, adagios, half-finished scales that faded before resolving. And sometimes, though he never remarked upon it, I caught him glancing toward the drawer where the manuscript lay. It was a week before Christmas when I ventured to speak of it again. We were seated before the fire, both of us nursing glasses of brandy while a light snow painted the streets in stillness. The gaslights outside glowed dimly, diffused by the falling flakes, and inside all was warmth, silence, and the low crackle of the hearth. "She was right, you know," I said, unprompted. "About that girl, Clara. She will become someone of note. Not because she copies what came before her, but because she respects it. That is a rare kind of courage." Holmes did not look up from his glass, but the corner of his mouth curved slightly. "She'll do well because she understands when to listen," he said, "and because she knows when not to perform." I nodded. "Trevelyan taught her that." "Trevelyan," Holmes murmured, "was perhaps the only artist I've encountered who learned that the absence of sound can be more arresting than the sound itself." We sat a while longer. Then I said, "I've thought of writing the case up." Holmes raised a brow. "Not for publication," I clarified, "merely for preservation. So it isn't lost." He was quiet for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "But don't begin with the music, Watson. Begin with the silence." That was where it started. I understood. It hadn't begun with the woman who came into our sitting room in velvet and fair, nor with the voice that drifted from an empty attic. It had begun, perhaps, even before Vale's death. At the first moment, someone chose to erase a truth and replace it with a more flattering lie. That lie had echoed until it became indistinguishable from memory, and only when it was sung aloud did its falseness crack. The case had not been about who killed whom or how. It had been about who remembered and why. A few days before Christmas, Holmes received an invitation, modest in appearance but heavy in implication. A small card, cream and gold, with embossed letters. "The Pavilion Theatre requests the pleasure of Mr. Sherlock Holmes's company for a private performance of winter pieces by the pupils of Miss Lark Trevelyan, to be held December 23rd, 8 o'clock sharp. Attendance discreet, no press. He showed it to me without comment. "You'll go?" I asked. Holmes stared at the fire for a long moment. "No," he said at last. "She does not need an audience of deduction. She needs silence. Let her students carry the melody forward." I said nothing, but when the night of the 23rd arrived, I walked past the pavilion on my way to an engagement. The theater was dimly lit, its front doors closed but not locked. I did not go inside. I simply paused across the street long enough to see the flicker of lights behind the upper windows and to hear, faintly, the rise of a single note, a young soprano, clear and clean, singing into the winter night, and from within that voice, I imagined, a memory softened, not erased, never that, but understood. When I returned to Baker Street later that evening, Holmes was awake, seated at his desk with his back to the fire. He had not shaved, and a curl of paper ash clung to the sleeve of his dressing gown. The manuscript drawer was closed again. "Well?" he asked, though he did not turn. "She did not sing," I said. But she smiled, and every student bowed to her as if she had. He nodded once. And then, in a voice barely above the rustle of paper, he said, "That is what justice looks like, Watson. Not always a courtroom. Sometimes just a quiet seat in the wings, watching the world continue without bitterness." I poured us both a drink, and we said no more of the case that night, nor in the days that followed. It had faded into its rightful place, neither tragedy nor triumph, but something more subtle, a return to balance. A correction. Years later, I would revisit the written account I kept hidden in my drawer, unpublished but carefully preserved, and when I read over it, I always lingered at one line, Holmes's own, spoken not as a man of logic, but as one of rare and reluctant grace. Ghosts only linger where they are wanted. And I knew in the end that this case had not been about a haunting. It had been about letting go. And Holmes, though he would never say so, had helped someone do exactly that, as had I, and so we let the city sing without us, and returned, as always, to the silence. It was several months later, in the mellow dusk of spring, when the last thread of the mystery untangled itself, not with the arrival of a telegram or a breathless client at our door, but through Holmes's own hand, as he often preferred to deliver his final conclusions. Not for spectacle, but for understanding. We had returned from a minor case in Reading, and as we settled in for the evening, Holmes retrieved a bundle of notes from his desk drawer, the ones marked, in his angular script, "The Trevelyan Affair." He placed them neatly before him on the table, added a final page, and looked over at me with a rare expression that signaled he had reached the end. Not just of the documentation, but of the mental architecture he had quietly constructed throughout the course of the case. "I imagine," he said, "that you wondered, from the beginning, why Cray acted when he did." I nodded. He could have orchestrated his theater of ghosts at any time. But he waited. Years, Holmes leaned back in his chair. Because someone told him when. He opened the drawer again and placed a small envelope beside the notes. I recognized it at once. One of the eased-eye anonymous letters we had dismissed as Cray's own fabrication. But now, Holmes pointed to the ink in the upper right corner, barely visible, a trace of faded red wax, thinner than the rest. Under the lamp, the impression was just legible. "Carnaby?" I said. "Madeline Vale." "She was never the passive director," Holmes replied. "She orchestrated everything. She watched Trevelyan's withdrawal, her return, her hesitation, and she chose the moment when the ghost would sing loudest. But she did not trust Cray, so she used him. When she saw he had truly lost his grip on reality, she disappeared." "And the recordings?" I asked. "The layers we heard, how did she obtain them?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That was the simplest part. She owned the rights to all of Vale's personal recordings, including the rehearsal reels and studio sessions with Trevelyan. I confirmed it through the society she managed under her alias. She had not only the motive to manipulate Lark Trevelyan's grief, but the materials to do it convincingly. She framed it all as a haunting, I said, but the ghost was hers to begin with. Holmes nodded, and that was her final act. Not revenge, but a play without an audience. She wanted Trevelyan to carry guilt, not because of Dorian's betrayal, but because she had been chosen instead of his wife. And yet, Trevelyan rejected that script. She walked off the stage. She chose to live, I said. She chose not to remember the lie. Holmes corrected gently, which is a different thing. He leaned forward and tapped the manuscript I had been working on in spare moments, the private, unpublished account of the affair. You have written it with care, Watson, but you must remember one thing. What's that? The truth was never about who played the final note. It was about who heard it. Cray composed noise. Vale composed memory. But Trevelyan, she composed silence. And silence, in the right hands, is a resolution all its own. I considered that a long while. Outside, the late light of April softened the edges of the buildings beyond Baker Street, and the sound of a violin from an open window somewhere down the block drifted in, tentative, imperfect, human. Holmes reached once more for his bow and violin, but did not raise them. Instead, he looked at me. You asked once why I took this case, he said. I assumed you were intrigued. Not quite, he said. I took it because it asked a question no one else had dared ask me. What happens when memory becomes a crime scene, when the victim is not the body, but the self? He was quiet a moment longer, then stood. And in answering it, he said, I found something rare. A case that did not end with justice or vengeance, but with a woman choosing her own voice. He began to play then. Just a few soft notes, unfamiliar and unhurried. They rose into the room like mist, hung there, and vanished. I did not speak again that night. Nor did he. We simply listened to the space between the notes, to the silence Trevelyan had claimed for herself. And in that silence, the case was finally, completely closed.